And now for what we're doing today. We're pleased to co-sponsor today's event. The library is pleased to co-sponsor today's event with the CICW, the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World, which is hosted by Shenandoah University. Our moderator this afternoon is Dr. Ermin Zinanovich. He is the center's executive director, and he's a prominent scholar on Islamic thought and culture, especially in academics. His main job there is to facilitate critical research and public engagement around lived experience of Muslims and academics and culture throughout the world. He works closely with Dr. Mirza, and so we're happy to have both of them here. Let's welcome them both. And then we'll launch it.
Well, thank you, Andy. Thank you for this kind introduction. And welcome everyone to this talk. The CICW is really happy to be a co-sponsor for this event. Our office is located in Loudoun campus in Leesburg, so if you're ever there, I'm there on a daily basis, stop by. I'll make you a cup of Turkish coffee, and we can chat about anything you want: basketball, football, the upcoming World Cup, and world politics and Islam and everything else in between, all the good stuff. All right, I just want to introduce Younus briefly and the topic, and then Younus is going to give us this talk. I'm sure that many of you know Dr. Younus Mirza. He is here, director of Berzemji Institute at Shenandoah University. He also teaches classes on religion, on Islam here at Shenandoah. But he's also more than that in many ways. He also works closely with the CICW. He's actually the president of the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World. He is a scholar in his own right of the Quranic studies and interfaith engagement, interfaith relations, especially Muslim-Christian relations, but also broadly Abrahamic religions. Dr. Mirza has a PhD in Islamic studies from Georgetown University. He has taught at Allegheny College in Pennsylvania before coming here to Shenandoah University. He is globally recognized as a scholar of Islam. He's given talks and lectures and presentations, and has taught at many different universities, not only here in the United States, but around the world. And he's highly sought after as a speaker, not only about his books, but also generally on Islam and interfaith relations. I wanted to mention that because sometimes when you know people on campus and you know them in their own capacity about the thing that you do and that's related, and we don't often know the people outside that context. And I can assure you, as someone who has known Younus for more than 10 years and who has worked closely with him, but also from the interaction with scholars around the world, that he is widely recognized as one of the leading voices in these studies, in the Quranic studies and interfaith. Today we have a very, very interesting book, a unique book, the Islamic Mary, Maryam Through the Centuries. Mary here in the title is Mary, the mother of Jesus. So an interesting thing, especially for those not coming from the Muslim faith, would be, what's Islamic about Mary? She is a Christian figure. And yet when you study interfaith, you quickly realize that many of the figures that we hold high in our respective Abrahamic traditions, whether it be Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, are also present in other of the two traditions. So if you hold a certain person very important in one of the three Abrahamic traditions, it's more likely than not that they are also mentioned in the other two. But sometimes the view and the perspective may differ. And this is what we have here today. Of course, for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, they all experience Mary a little differently. And that depends on how they view Jesus in their own theology. And we know that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have different theological views of Jesus, basically through the whole spectrum of possibilities, so to say. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is so important in Christianity and Islam because she is seen as, in Islamic tradition, as a mother of one of the most highly regarded prophets in Islamic tradition, So Islam considers Jesus to be a highly regarded prophet, but of course stops short of ascribing divinity to him, and this is where, of course, there is difference between many of the Christian interpretations of Jesus and Islamic interpretation of Jesus. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is an important figure, and it's interesting that every time Jesus is mentioned in the Quran, and the Arabic word for Jesus is Isa, he is mentioned as Isa ibn Maryam, Jesus the son of Mary. And this is an obvious reference to the Christian claim that Jesus is the Son of God, something that Islam does not accept, and Judaism wouldn't accept either, because there is this strict monotheism and emphasis on that in Judaism and Islam. Not to say that Christianity is not a monotheistic religion, but obviously differently interpreted. And so Mary is not only important, but there's a whole chapter in the Quran, in the Muslim scripture, which Muslims believe to be the Word of God, that is titled Mary, that contains the story of Mary and her pregnancy and giving birth to Jesus and baby Jesus and all of these things. And I think for many Christians especially, this comes as a surprise often, because they do not think that Islam has anything to say about Jesus or Mary, and often do not even know that Islam views and Muslim view Jesus and Mary in very high regard and hold them in high regard as special people. And so over the centuries, Islamic tradition has developed a view of Mary, not just from the way that she's mentioned in the scripture, but the way that her example is experienced in the lives of the Muslims. And so Dr. Mirza is going to walk us through this, to walk us through the understanding of Mary in the Quran, then to tell us how Muslims traditionally and historically understood the role of Mary, what does she represent as a symbol, and all the other theological and non-theological things related to that. So I assure you, you are in for an intellectual feast. This book has been superbly received in the academic community. Younus has given a number of talks, and we are also happy that he is coming home now and doing this talk with us here at Shenandoah. So without further ado, help me in welcoming Dr. Younus Mirza.
So I want to thank Herman and Andy for inviting me here and being part of this program and presentation. Part of my teaching, I always bring my students to the library because I always enjoy the staff and the camaraderie, the facilities. Maybe we can give a round of applause to all the librarian staff. You do such a wonderful job, and part of my secret inclination of bringing my students here is I get an opportunity to experience the library. And also, I always learn something new from their presentations. So for today, I want to speak about my book, Islamic Mary, Maryam Through the Centuries. And this is a book that has evolved and developed over the last couple of years, and it's very much connected to my identity on campus. Shenandoah University has in many ways helped produce this book, or birth this book into the world in terms of the Brzezinski Institute for Global Virtual Learning, as well as some of the international partnership and global education work. So to begin, here are some questions to think about, then we'll move into maybe my personal origins of this book, how I became interested in this topic, talk about the chapter of Mary in the Quran, which Herman mentioned, and then conclude with why this is all important. So first off, some questions for us to think about is how is the biblical and Quranic Mary, Maryam, similar and different? So part of my work in interfaith understanding and comparative scriptures is to say, yes, these figures are shared across traditions, but they're similar, but they're different, right? How are they both similar and different, and what can we learn in the process? Also, can Mary and Maryam be interfaith figures? So a lot of my work at the Brzezinski Institute is to think about ways of similarities. How can we build partnerships with different people, shared figures and projects? And could Mary or Abraham or Moses or other figures be a bridge between the various traditions? And then how can Maryam be a model for modern people and an inspiration for social justice? So in the world that we live in today, there's so many different challenges, whether that's climate change or food insecurity or gender equality. We're looking back to the past to find inspiration for us to confront these modern challenges. So let's begin with the personal origins of the book. You may be questioning and asking, how did Younus become interested in this topic? So first off, I grew up in a family of five. So I have 3 sisters, as many of you know, and I have a very strong mother. And I don't have any brothers. And unfortunately, my dad passed away recently, as many of you know, so I don't have any more male immediate figures in my family. And growing up in this family, I was always trying to get involved in my sister's activities, to the point that their Girl Scout troop made me an honorary member. And as I became an honorary member of this troop, I began to learn more about women's issues and challenges and struggles. And now I'm older, and I'm married, and I have 3 daughters. I don't have any sons. And now I've grown up, and I'm actually the cookie manager of my daughter's Girl Scout troops. And I actually brought Girl Scout cookies here today, so you can get some Samoas, trefoils, tagalongs. If you want to buy some, let me know also. And I've recently been promoted to the service unit cookie manager. And we sold 15,000 boxes of cookies.
You bought 10,000.
And you can see that I'm always getting out the cookies everywhere. So in this kind of world, right, growing up with girls, with a strong mother, and now growing up as a father, these questions about women and religion, what are the challenges, what are the obstacles, have always dominated my mind, especially as a father, right? My daughters are growing up in this world. How can they relate to modernity, to tradition, to religion, and society? And it's also connected to my first book, which is the Bible and the Quran, biblical figures in the Islamic tradition. And in this book, my co-author and I, John Kaltner, we found that there are 48 shared figures between the Bible and the Quran. And this was surprising to me. At first, I thought it was just some of the major figures, like Abraham and Moses, and Jesus and Mary. But we saw there were so many different figures. And because of my background, I became very fascinated with Mary and this female figure that's so prominent within the Islamic and the Quranic tradition. And as someone who is named Younus, right, I became really fascinated with the Bible and the Quran. And I was growing up in Northern Virginia, I was the only Younus in my class. And people sometimes would have struggled to say it or pronounce it. They would call me Younus, they would call me Younus. One time, my football coach, he would always call me Younus. Younus, Younus do this, Younus do that. And one time I corrected him, I said, Coach, my name is Younus. And he said, don't worry, Younus, I'll get it right. So having a name that's peculiar or unique makes you think about it. Right? What is the origins of this name? And as I did my research, I saw the equivalent was, does anyone know? Jonah, right? So it was Jonah. So when I would talk to people, and people would say, oh, Younus, what does that mean, or where does that come from? I would say, that's Jonah. And they would say, oh yeah, Jonah and the whale, right? And they would immediately have a cultural connection. So growing up in the United States as a minority with a unique name made me think about the importance of the connection between the Quran and the Bible. And this book really represents my university education as well. I grew up in Northern Virginia, I went to Langley High School, close to the CIA, and then I went to Georgetown University. And at Georgetown University, they have this emphasis of educating the whole person, the soul and the mind. And part of the course and part of the curriculum was to take 2 theology courses. And I took the problem of God, and I also took a course about Islam and the West. And it was in the university where 9/11 happened. And as you know, 9/11 happened in New York, but also happened in Washington, D.C. I was actually studying Arabic, and a fellow student came into the class, and she said, do you all know what happened? And we said, what? What happened? And she said, we've been attacked. Class was immediately canceled. I went to a friend's dorm room, seeing the Twin Towers being attacked and planes being flown into it, hoping that this was an accident, trying to go home. At the time, we had Nokia cell phones. All those cell phone towers were jammed. I couldn't get any contact with my folks. I got into my car, and it took me a couple of hours to finally get home. And I remember going to campus later that week and thinking that my life had changed. How would people perceive the way I looked, my name, right? What would be the new world that would emerge with the invasion of Afghanistan and then the war in Iraq? So with that, let's go ahead and dive into Maryam, and particularly some interesting facts. So Mary is the only female name explicitly mentioned in the Quran. And people sometimes ask, why is that the case? And I believe that's the case because many of the names that are mentioned in the Quran, Muhammad saw them as models for himself. And I believe that Mary was one of the models that Muhammad and the early Muslim community saw as a model of emulation. We also see she's mentioned 34 times in the Quran, most of the time in reference to being Jesus' mother. So this is a remarkable number, and even more than other prophetic figures that are mentioned. We see that she has an entire chapter that we'll look at regarding her, about Mary. But she's not mentioned only in that chapter. She's mentioned from the beginning to the end. And as Ermin mentioned, when Jesus is mentioned or talked about in the Quran, he's always introduced as Jesus, the son of Mary. And I believe this is also elevating Jesus, because Mary is seen as such an important reverential figure within Islam that he's not just Jesus, he's Jesus, the son of Mary. Right? He's coming from an important motherly figure. And there are more verses about her in the Quran than in the Bible. And that's really shocking and sometimes puzzling for a lot of audiences, that you think that in the New Testament, for instance, there'll be a lot of references to Mary, and there are some really important ones that we'll discuss. But the Quran mentions her again and again, demonstrating what I believe is that the Muslim community saw her as a model to follow. And as we discussed, there's an entire chapter or surah that's named after her that talks about her story, the birth of Jesus, her struggles, her questioning with God, and finally the resolution of the birth of Jesus. And as we'll further discuss, she's mentioned in the prophetic literature as one of the best women. And she's mentioned as someone who was chosen by God and chosen as a model for the Muslim community. So now I'll just jump into the chapter of Mary. Right? This is a chapter that I just became so interested and fascinated about when I was reading, whether it's the rhyme scheme or the themes and discussions of emotions and vulnerability. And this is the only chapter in the Quran that starts with this interesting rhyme scheme. It has kaf, ha, ya, ayn, sad. So many chapters in the Quran, they start with a particular melody. For the beginning chapters, you have alif, lam, mim. In the middle, you have alif, lam, ra. Later, you have noon, right? You have alif, and then hamim, and so forth. But this is the only chapter that has this beginning. And I believe this demonstrates that this chapter is unique and different than other chapters in the Quran. Many times you have a group of chapters with a similar beginning, with a similar sound. And then later on, you have also a cluster of chapters. But this chapter is unique and stands on its own. And this is the only chapter that has a rhyme scheme of iya. So many times when people read the Quran, they want to read it like the Bible. And there's many similarities and commonalities between the two. But the Quran in many ways is poetry. The sound is so much connected with meaning. And this chapter is unique, is that it has a rhyme scheme of iya that goes from the beginning all the way to the end. And this is a chapter that emerges in the Meccan era. So in Islam and Quranic studies, you have the Meccan era where the Prophet Muhammad was a minority, and then you have the Medinan area where he becomes the head of a polity and a city-state. And this era, especially which the chapter of Mary emerges, was an era known in the Islamic tradition of the year of sadness. He lost his wife, Khadija, who was somewhat of a source of comfort to him. He had lost his uncle, who was a protector. Many of the Muslim community had been persecuted. Many of them migrated to Africa, to Abyssinia, to find refuge. And in this moment of darkness, this chapter emerges. And you can see many of the themes of vulnerability, of pain and suffering discussed, as well as hope and redemption. And we see that this chapter mentions God almost always as Ar-Rahman, or the most merciful. So God is mentioned many times in the Quran and the biblical tradition, and mentioned in different ways. But in this chapter, the idea of mercy emerges. And in the Meccan era, in the Arabian Peninsula, there was this idea of this God, right? This transcendent, powerful God. But people were intimidated by this God, that they felt this God could destroy them. And if they didn't repent and they didn't return back to Him, He would be destructive. But there's this idea of mercy. That yes, God is powerful, He is almighty, but at the same time, He is very kind and loving with his power. And lastly, this is the only chapter that uses the word wudda, or intense love. Right? So there's some peculiarities, things that make this chapter unique and different from the way it begins, to its rhyme scheme, and to some of the words that are used. So let's go ahead and jump into the chapter in the Quran and compare it with the biblical tradition. So the chapter, and specifically the section on Mary, begins and says, mentioned in the Quran the story of Mary. She withdrew from her family to a place to the east and secluded herself away. We sent our Spirit to appear before her in the form of a perfected man. She said, I seek the Lord of mercy's protection against you. If you have any fear of him, do not approach. But he said, I'm not but a messenger from your Lord, come to announce to you the gift of a pure son. She said, how can I have a son when no man has touched me? I have not been unchaste. And he said, this is what your Lord said, it is easy for me. We shall make him a sign to all people, a blessing from us. So first off, the story begins and it talks about the story of Mary. Right? So mention the story of Mary. And recently I was in a discussion with a student, and the student was saying, oh, aren't all women in the Bible and the Quran, aren't they relational? Right? Aren't they always connected with someone else? Right? They don't stand on their own. And I said, well, look at this verse, right? It mentions the story of Mary, right? She's not connected to anyone. And this is part of the argument I make in my book, that Mary is her own figure, a protagonist, and seen as someone who stands on her own 2 feet. And she withdrew from her family to a place to the east and secluded herself away. So what we see here is fascinating, is that she withdraws. And there's this idea in the Islamic tradition of i'tikaf or khalwa, of being alone in isolation. And that is when the divine message and communication occurs. And we see this with the life of the Prophet Muhammad. That when did the first revelations occur? When he goes to the cave of Hira. So the idea of seclusion is essential for divine communication. And this compares and is different than the biblical tradition, where Mary is with other people. So in the biblical tradition, she's with Elizabeth and the community, and they're welcoming the figure of Jesus, that the Messiah, that he's going to come and redeem humanity. But in the Quran, there's this idea of seclusion. And the Quran then says, we sent our Spirit. And the Quranic commentators discussed this and debated this. Who is this Spirit? And the majority agree that it's Gabriel or Jibreel. So the idea that Mary is by herself, she's in isolation, but then the Spirit arrives, the angel of Gabriel, to speak to her and communicate the divine will. And she said, I seek the Lord of mercy's protection against you if you have any fear of him. So this is fascinating, that when angel Gabriel is coming, she's afraid. She doesn't understand, and she actually doesn't recognize him at first. And Rumi has some nice poetry on this particular verse, and it says, this is the first step often in truth, that you're actually afraid. Right? You don't actually accept it immediately, that you're a little hesitant, right, before you realize its true reality. And she, once again, seeks the protection of the Lord of mercy. Right? The idea of God of being merciful is something that's always mentioned here in the Quran. And then the angel responds and he says, I'm a messenger from your Lord, right? He now is announcing himself, explaining who he is, and I'm going to give you the gift of a pure son, right? So the angel now is telling her what is about to occur, that she's going to have the baby Jesus. And then she responds. And I love this verse because she says, how can I have a son when no man has touched me, right? So she could have just said, okay, God wants this, right? I'm going to do it, right? But she has this questioning, and this is part of a Quranic and biblical theme where the figures, they question the divine will. They don't always accept it. They don't understand the rationality behind it. There's a famous story in the Quran on Abraham where he asked God about life and death. He said, God, I don't understand about life and death and resurrection. How is this going to occur? And then God says, don't you believe, Abraham? And Abraham says, I believe, but I want to have tranquility in my heart. Right? So the idea that questioning actually leads to potentially more certainty. And then the angel explains, and this is what your Lord said, it is easy for me, we shall make him a sign to all people, a blessing from us. And this is the Quranic message of Jesus, that Jesus is a sign. He is someone who's seen as a blessing. And he's someone that, as we see later on, announces his life as that of peace. And then the story continues. And so it was ordained, she conceived him. She withdrew to a distant place. And when the pains of childbirth drove her to cling to the trunk of a palm tree, she exclaimed, I wish I had been dead and forgotten long before all this. But a voice cried to her from below, do not worry, your Lord has provided a stream at your feet. And if you shake the trunk of the palm tree towards you, it will deliver fresh ripe dates for you. So eat, drink, be glad, and say to anyone you may see, I have vowed to the Lord of mercy to abstain from conversation, and I will not talk to anyone today. So once again, you see this theme of her withdrawing. Right? She's not with other people. She's alone by herself, making her in need of God and dependent upon him. And then when the pains of the childbirth emerges, and this is once again unique because in the biblical tradition, she's actually singing the praise of God. Jesus is emerging, right? The Son of God. And in this moment, it's a moment of joy. But in the Quranic version, we have the pain. Right? And once again, this is connected, I believe, to the late Meccan era. Also, you have other verses in the Quran that talk about the pain of childbirth and praising mothers and explaining that this is one of the reasons why you should respect them, because they went through labor and pregnancy and the nurse. And she had this pain, so she went to the trunk of a palm tree. And when my publisher was asking me, which cover do you want? I said, I want this scene. Right? I want this scene of Mary, by herself, standing next to the palm tree and shaking it, asking for the divine favor, because this demonstrates her as a unique figure and as a protagonist. And then she explained, I wish I had been dead and forgotten long before all of this. And when I first read this verse, I was like, is this heretical? Didn't the angel Gabriel come and tell her, you're going to do this, and you're going to have Jesus, and this is what's going to happen, and didn't she accept the divine will? But she's, in a very raw and open way, she's talking about her pain and suffering. And she says that, I wish I was not alive. And when I looked at the different commentators, I was trying to see, are the commentators, are they kind of condemning Mary for making this statement? But many of them actually praise her, and they say this is actually the etiquette of the righteous. That the righteous, when they're in a very difficult situation, they complain to God. They speak about their tragedies, and they say, I wish I was not in this particular situation. So Mary here is actually exemplar. She's actually talking and being very open about how she is feeling. But a voice cried to her from below, right? And who is this voice? Commentators debate. Is it Jesus? Right? Is the baby Jesus now speaking to his mom and saying, Mom, don't worry, things are going to be okay? Or this is Angel Gabriel that's coming back and now comforting her. Both opinions are valid, but majority say is the angel. And it says, do not worry, right? And once again, this is something I've become very interested in the Quran, the Bible, how it talks about emotions, right? It's not just simply about actions, but it talks about sadness, fear, and hope, and anger. And it says, do not worry, your Lord has provided a stream at your feet, and if you shake the trunk of the palm tree towards you, it will deliver fresh, ripe dates for you. So she actually has to take an action, right? God will not just send it to her, she actually has to stand up and shake the palm tree. And anyone who's actually been in a tropical climate and seen palm trees, they're very difficult to shake, right? If you shake it, nothing's going to fall, right? But the idea is that she's making that effort. In a similar way, in the biblical and Quranic tradition, you have Moses. He goes and he has a staff, and God tells him, hit the Red Sea, right? It will open for you, right? Does the staff really open the Red Sea? No, but it's more about the idea of taking that initiative. And then the voice continues to say, so eat, drink, be glad, and say to anyone you may see, I have vowed to the Lord of mercy to abstain from conversation, and I will not talk to anyone today. So the voice is saying, now you're in the state of comfort, you're eating, you're drinking, you're in a state of being glad, and you need to engage in Sawm, right? So in the Islamic tradition, Sawm is connected to fasting. So in the month of Ramadan just passed, and oftentimes in Ramadan we think about fasting as just in terms of food, right? Not eating or drinking. But here she's abstaining from conversation, so God will give her a speech later on. And we'll see how that speech emerges with that of Jesus. And now we reach the climax and the conclusion of the story, where she goes back to her people carrying the child. And they say, Mary, you have done something terrible. "Sister of Aaron, your father was not an evil man, your mother was not unchaste." She pointed at him. They said, "How can we converse with an infant?" But he said, "I'm the servant of God. He granted me the scripture, made me a prophet, made me blessed wherever I may be. He commanded me to pray, to give alms as long as I live, to cherish my mother. He did not make me domineering or graceless. Peace was on me the day I was born, and will be on me the day I die, and the day I'm raised to life again." Such was Jesus, the Son of Mary. So she now returns back to her people, and she's carrying the baby Jesus in her hand. And they remark, "Mary, you've done something terrible." So they immediately think that she's had a child out of wedlock. They know that she's not engaged or married. In the Islamic tradition, there's no Joseph, right? So in the biblical tradition, you have this idea that she's maybe engaged or she's already with Joseph. But Joseph is not even mentioned in the chapter of Mary, once again speaking to her prominence. And then they continue and they say, "Sister of Aaron," right? You come from this very noble family, right? Your father was not an evil man, right? Your dad was a good guy. And your mother was not chaste, right? How could you have done such a horrible thing? And this, once again, speaks to a cultural climate where women are often judged harshly, and there's a double standard there with men. And then, because she's taken this fast of silence, she points to her child, right? To Jesus. And then they mock her once again, and they say, "How can we converse with an infant? How can this child speak?" And then, all of a sudden, this miracle. And this is once again very Quranic, that the baby Jesus begins to speak, and he says, "I'm a servant of God. He's granted me scripture and made me a prophet, and made me blessed wherever I may be." Right? So you see this kind of Islamic conception of Jesus being an important prophetic figure who is not domineering, who's not graceless. And he says that I'm going to pray and give alms and to cherish my mother. And I love that phrase, that this little baby, right, is already saying, I'm going to be good to my mother. And then he says, "Peace was on me the day I was born, and will be on the day I die, and the day I'm raised to life again." And this speaks to the idea, I know many of you may have celebrated Easter, right, the idea of Jesus being raised back to God. You have kind of inklings of that also within the Quran. Such was Jesus, son of Mary, right? So this is Jesus, but who is Jesus? He's the son of this wonderful and important figure. So to move to the next section here, I want to speak about how this story in the Quran reverberated and was received throughout the Islamic tradition. So some of the Quranic commentators looking at this story, they mentioned the importance of Mary and also her potentially even being a prophet. So one interesting verse in the Quran, the Imran's wife, or Mary's mother, Anna, or Hannah in the Islamic tradition, she makes a statement and she says, "I'm going to devote what's in my stomach to God," right? That what's in my stomach is actually going to eventually become a rabbi, right? And all of a sudden, when she gives birth, she said, "My Lord, I've given birth to a girl," right? And she's in shock, right? Because she had this dream as a mother that her child is going to serve the temple, is going to become a rabbi, is going to be a male. But all of a sudden, she sees this child as a girl, and then goes to God and says, "God, what should I do in this particular case?" And then the divine voice says in the Quran, God knew best what she gave birth to, the male is not like the female, right? So the message in the Quran is saying that, yes, we all knew all along there was going to be a woman, and we're going to name her Mary, and we're going to commend her and her offspring for your protection from the rejected Satan. And this is a similar theme within the Quran, where it praises and celebrates daughters, right? So in the Arab kind of tradition, they would sometimes bury their daughters, or they would become sad and frown when they would have female offspring. But the Quranic tradition condemns that and says, no, there's an importance of having daughters. The Prophet Muhammad was known not to have also any male offspring, but was a father of many daughters. We also see that in the same chapter, the angels said to Mary, "Mary, God has chosen you and made you pure, and He has truly chosen you above all women." And in Arabic, the word is islafa, right? The one that's been chosen. And it's mentioned twice in this verse and in other verses. And this is actually the same verb that's used to talk about Muhammad. Muhammad is Mustafa. He's the one who is chosen. So Mary, in many ways, is a chosen person and a model of emulation. And in the chapter we just read, the angel comes and says, I'm a messenger from your Lord. And some Quranic commentators, such as Qurtubi and Ibn Hazm in Spain, they said Mary must be a prophet because a divine messenger came and spoke directly to her. And they define prophecy as someone who had direct communication from God, not simply one who had dreams or inspiration. And they said, in particular Qurtubi, he said she was one of the greatest Islamic prophets, maybe one of the top 5 among Abraham and Moses. And we have prophetic traditions where the Prophet Muhammad praises Mary and includes her as among the best women. He says the best women of creation are 4: Mary, Maryam bint Imran, Asiya bint Muzahim, the wife of Pharaoh, Khadija bint Khuwaylid, the wife of the Prophet Muhammad, and Fatima bint Muhammad, the daughter of Muhammad. And what's important here is this idea of an Abrahamic tradition, right? So Fatima was his daughter that lived with him, and Khadija was his wife. After he got these first inclinations of revelation, he went to Khadija to find solace and comfort. But he includes that of Asiya, who was the wife of Pharaoh, and one who adopted Moses. And we also have that Mary, a figure who's seen as a Christian kind of figure. So these different figures from these various traditions are combined and seen as the most righteous women. We also see different archetypes in this tradition. Mary is a single mother. We also have Asiya, who adopts the child of Moses, the Khadija, the righteous wife, and Fatima, the ideal daughter. And then similarly, we have this tradition mentioning Khadija, Fatima, Mary, and Asiya once again, and mentioning them in terms of paradise. That these are the women of paradise, and these are the models of emulation. So to conclude, I want to talk about how is Mary relevant today. And we went to my personal origins, and then we went deep into scripture. And now let's talk about contemporary global politics and civilization. So growing up in the 1990s, there was this theory called the clash of civilizations, that there was this inevitable clash between the West and the rest, right? The West had to focus on itself, its language, its culture, its civilization, and we needed to build borders, strong borders around us, because we were in constant competition against other civilizations. And this theory especially took hold after the fall of communism. There was initially the red threat, right, the communist threat. And then now there was the green threat, right, the threat of Islam. That Islam has bloody borders, as Samuel Huntington says in the book. And then there was this Confucian civilization of China that was rising that we needed to also protect ourselves against. And we see that this theory kind of emerges in different forms, in different eras in the last couple of years. At the same time, there was a counter movement, especially after 9/11, that said, hey, do we really have to have a clash of civilizations? Can we actually live together, coexist, live in a more pluralistic and harmonious world? And they coalesced around the figure of Abraham and the children of Abraham. That look, we're Abrahamic figures, right? Their idea of Isaac, of Ishmael, and the various religious traditions are the offspring of this original father. And in many ways, Abraham is this classic patriarch, right? He's the father, right? And then he has sons. And those sons have other sons, right? And those sons eventually lead to Muhammad and that of Moses and Jesus. But in the last couple of years, there's been a focus on Mary. And there's been several books that have come out talking about Mary and importance, how she's important in Christian-Muslim dialogue, as well as interreligious dialogue in general. And I believe this focus on Mary is part of a realization that the world's largest religions are Christianity and Islam, and that we need to live together to have a more peaceful and harmonious world. And also Mary opens up new possibilities, right? She's a matriarch, right? She's a woman. She's a mother, right? She's someone that lets us think more about female leadership and female spirituality, right? And there's renewed interest in the role of women in religious communities. And in terms of global demographics, we see that in the year 2050, that the religions of Christianity and Islam, Christians and Muslims, will roughly be the same. And I kind of joke with my students, by 2050 I hope to be retired in some like island. I'm putting my my retirement, I'm getting the matching from my university every month. And we see that 30% of the world's population will be Christian, around 29% being that Muslims. So the relationship between these two religious communities will impact all religions, whether that's Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, and others. And I think this realization is enshrined in some of the theological documents. So in 2007 in Amman, Jordan, there was a common word. And this was a group of Muslim theologians that came together. And they said, we need to make a statement about Islam's relationship with the rest of the world and other religious communities. And they began their document by saying Muslims and Christians together make up well over half of the world's population. Without peace and justice between these two religious communities, there can be no meaningful peace in the world. The future of the world depends on peace between Muslims and Christians. So they have this understanding and realization that yes, we're talking about theology and talking about scripture, but this has real life political implications. And we're seeing that even today as we speak. And in this world where we're seeing more religious traditions, we're having people identify with religion but also without religion and focusing on spirituality, we see that there are common pilgrimage sites. And this is one place in Ephesus, Turkey, which is known as the House of the Virgin Mary. So in one particular room, you find Christians worshiping with a statue of Mary, especially many Catholics. And then in another room, you have the chapter of Mary, written in Quran and calligraphy, and many Muslims going there and also making a prayer. And this house was actually discovered. There was a Catholic nun who had certain dreams and visions that Mary's last life was in this town of Ephesus and was in this particular house. So this house was discovered, and then Christians initially started, but then Muslims started to visit the site as well because they saw the importance of Mary within their own tradition. And now over 1 million people every year visit this house. And the Turkish government is promoting this house as a tourism spot and also as a way to talk about their ecumenical and peaceful past and hopefully future. And this Mary has also come in discussions of Islamophobia. So in Islamophobia, there's the idea of the clash of civilizations and the idea that Muslims are the other, right? They are anti-us, right? They're the opposite of what we believe. If we're civilized, they're barbaric. If we're peaceful, they're violent, right? If we're rational, right, they're just spiritual and engage with loose religious practice. So many Muslims have been turning to Mary and saying, well, Mary actually is a shared figure. And some of the practices which we may associate with Islam, such as wearing a headscarf or a hijab, or even prayer or fasting, these are things that Christians and Christian communities have historically practiced as well. And we see that Mary is important in terms of social justice and equity. A lot of times when I speak to my students, they are interested in questions of religion and spirituality, but they want to know, how does religion and spirituality connect with making the world a better place? And in one particular recent documentary, Moda Haider, she talks about interfaith encounter. And she goes in North America on this road trip trying to examine the history of Muslims in America. And she goes into this church. And when she walks into this church, she sees a statue of Mary. And all of a sudden, she's in a state of awe. And she begins to have this reflection about Mary in her own life. And she has this interesting dialogue with a pastor about the role of Mary within both of their traditions. And she makes this remark that Maryam is an inspiration to her in the way that she was tender and loving and devout to God, so much so that she could raise a child that could change the entire world. So Mona Haider is an artist, she's an activist, she sings and has various music videos that challenge Islamophobia and the idea of a world that's built on the clash of civilization theory. So she's finding Mary as a personal inspiration to her and as someone that can bridge the different divides. And to conclude, you might be asking, okay, how is this all connected to me being the director of the Brzezinski Institute at Shenandoah University? And part of my research was reflecting the other day in the last 15 years is to give voice, right? Give voice to historical figures who've been overlooked. And part of my work has been trying to give voice to Mary, right? As someone who is an important figure that's recognized in the various traditions, but not always seen as a protagonist and figure in her own right. And that's really, we're very much connected to the idea of virtual exchange and COIL, where we're trying to give voice to students from around the world and also to faculty members in different regions, whether that be the Middle East, Southeast Asia, or Europe. Oftentimes we hear about these people in the news and in film, but we don't always hear from them directly. And that's really essential part of my work. And part of my work has been to find these shared figures between the Bible and the Quran, but it's also connected to the idea of shared figures and projects. So part of our work in the Office of Global Engagement and in the Mirzinji Institute is to find ways we can collaborate and build international partnerships. But those international partnerships have to be built on something, right? Whether that be climate change or food insecurity and that of gender equality. So when we meet with our partners, our first inclination, our discussion is not how we're different, because of course we're all different in our various ways, but what are our shared visions and goals? Right? How do we want to make the world a better place? And part of a project that Amy helped with and actually helped launch is with Yarmouth University, and we actually eventually got a grant to work on, was to research food insecurity in our different locales, to study that food pantries in our various universities and cities. And one of the members of our project, Rebecca Gibson, went on and started Buzzy's Food Pantry on campus. And I want to give a shout out to her and to the Center of Civic Engagement for participating in this project, encouraging all of us to think about how we can alleviate food insecurity within our communities. So to conclude, we talked about the importance of Mary, Maryam in Islam. So Mary is not simply a marginal figure, but she's, in my view, someone who is central. She's a protagonist. We also see that the story of Mary and Maryam in the Quran talks about so many important themes, that of vulnerability, of pain and suffering, but also finding hope and redemption, as well as inspiration with the community, as well with the divine. And we also see her high status within the Islamic tradition, that she is someone that many Muslims read about her within the Quranic tradition, but they may not realize or even know that there are actually arguments that she was a prophetic figure, or that many of her stories parallel that of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and that she was seen as among the best women. And we see that Mary is not just a historical figure that lives in the Middle Ages, but she's someone that continues to be relevant in the modern era. And I believe all of us, we love our modern lives, right? We love the food, right? We love the smartphones, the tablets. But at the same time, we want to be connected to history and tradition and be part of a legacy. And we want to find inspiration in the past of people who can help us confront our modern challenges. And I believe Mary is one of those people that can help us build a more harmonious, pluralistic, and peaceful world. Thank you very much. Thanks so much. And I just have this quiz if anyone wants to play. And you can find us on social media as well. And then also, please visit the Office of Global Engagement and the Mirzinji Institute.
All right, thank you so much, Younus, for this wonderful, captivating presentation. We're going to sit around the table and pretend we're in some pantheon of, as we are actually, of learning. There's no better place than a library. So we're going to open it up for a conversation or a discussion or questions. But before that, I just want to ask something. So it is obvious that for Muslims and Christians, Mary is a central figure. But both Mary and Jesus were from the Jewish community. They were Jews. And so does that play any particular role, or what dimension can you add to the conversation by also being cognizant of this fact?
Yeah, so that's a really good point, and I think in the Islamic tradition there is this idea that these are Jewish figures, right? They come from the children of Israel. They also are figures who are seen as part of that community. And they are also speaking to the idea of an Abrahamic kind of tradition and faith. So I think for Quran and I think the Islamic tradition is to universalize their examples. So it's not simply about them being Jews or part of the children of Israel, but how can Mary, how can Jesus be models for everyone, right? So how can their models of faith, of suffering, of redemption be models of emulation? And I think the Quran and also the Bible, it straddles this line of talking about the children of Israel, talking about the history, emphasizing, yes, their Jewish figures, but also speaking to this larger idea of faith, of Iman, of Islam, or of conscientious submission to God. So, yeah.
All right, thank you. Well, before we continue, I noticed there's quite a lot of food over there as well. So feel free to get some or even to get some to go. Don't be shy. All right, any questions or comments or anything? Yes, go ahead.
Hey, sorry, I'm hiding behind you.
Yeah.
I thought that was really interesting. And this semester I'm teaching Renaissance Reformation. And one of the things that we've been talking about, well, obviously the Reformation, but one of the things we talk about is where Protestantism tends to split off from Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox. And I thought it was really interesting that you're looking at it in terms of Islam and Christianity when so many Christians minimize the importance of Mary and then others accentuate her importance. So I'd just like you to comment on that.
Oh yeah, that's a really good point, and a lot of Catholics are really excited about the book and about the emphasis on Mary, and that leads to the question of Protestants and how do Protestants see Jesus and how do they see Mary? So I was actually a part of a panel at Wheaton College, and there was this debate and discussion among Protestants about the role of Mary. And many of them said, yeah, we see Mary as simply a vessel, right? She's just bringing Jesus, right, to the community. So that's her role. Where there was one interesting scholar there who was a Protestant from the Episcopalian tradition. She was saying, no, there's like intentionality of the fact that Jesus could have disappeared or God could have created him, but the idea that Jesus came through Mary, right? And that God wanted that to occur. So I think there's this interesting movement even within Protestant traditions to consider her role and to realize that she's also an important figure. Also, I think it's actually a part of ecumenical relations as well, because I spoke at a panel at Valparaiso University, and it was similar to what you were saying, like a Muslim-Christian dialogue. So at the event, there was both Protestants and Catholics there. So one of the Christians came to me and said, this is interesting, we've never seen Catholics and Protestants at a similar event before. So they were saying, wow, the Islamic Mary, or discussions about Islamic Mary, are actually making Christians talk to each other more about the role of Mary within their traditions. So I thought that was really interesting, that within this discussion with interreligious studies, it's not simply a kind of one religion talking to another religion, but religions within themselves kind of speaking to each other and saying, okay, what is the role of women within our religion? What's the role of motherhood? What's the role of pregnancy, female leadership, spirituality? And I think those debates are impacting everyone, right? Whether you're Sunni or you're Shi'i or whether you're Protestant or you're Catholic, all of us are kind of dealing with similar questions.
This is such an interesting thing. So it's almost as if for intra-Christian communication dialogue that takes place, like there needs to be somebody from outside the tradition to bring them together. And in this case, it was Muslims, and I think this is interesting because it's not often perceived as such, number one. Number two, with all the negative press that Muslims generally receive around the world, and especially here in the United States, you don't see them as building bridges, and building bridges among Christians themselves, you know. So I think this is a wonderful thing that comes out of projects like this, is that it creates this place for conversation, not just for interfaith, but intra-faith conversation as well. And it can be stimulated by these kind of engagements. When people discover maybe the roots that they've known, but maybe got kind of sidelined in their own tradition, and they rediscover them because another tradition has been able to do that to some extent, you know. So this is a great example of that. I think we need more of that, you know, when we have that intra-faith and interfaith conversation, how each could facilitate one another. I think that's a beautiful thing. Anybody else? Other questions or comments? Yes, Andy, and then we'll come to you.
So it's a bookish question, I'm sorry, but how was the process of writing a book without a co-author different than your first book? Was it, just speak to that if you don't mind.
Oh yeah, it was definitely harder because John, he wrote like 50, probably 60%, to be honest, like of the book, and then he would write the first sections, and then I would come and add to what he was saying. So this was something to kind of take from the beginning, and then I talk about this in the conclusion, that it really takes time to write a book, and a project, and it takes a lot of effort in the sense that you've been thinking about something for a very long time, and sometimes years, right? And I really identify with some of these metaphors about pregnancy and labor and even nursing. And this idea that we can all be like kind of pregnant with something, but it's still kind of forming and developing and metastasizing until the point where it's ready to come out to the world. So I think for me, this was like kind of like I mentioned it from my childhood. You're always thinking about these themes, and then you're thinking about that, and then you're finally like, okay, it's ready to kind of come out. I'm ready to kind of share it with other people. And then, of course, you can have other kids and other books and other projects. But I think it was a unique experience. That the first book was kind of with a co-author coming from a Christian background, and then myself kind of coming up with this project and developing it. In many ways, it was inspired by John, and this part of the interreligious understanding and relations that he actually wrote about the Muslim Mary, and he was also interested in female figures within the Bible and Quran, and then I kind of built off many of those points. So definitely it took courage. It definitely is something that was in the back of my mind for a long time, but yeah, it's definitely rewarding. So yeah, I would encourage everyone to kind of reflect on that, like what do they have them thinking about or inside them that's percolating, and when will they be able to share it?
You mentioned briefly about Mary's sort of origins in the Quran, her family origin. Could you speak to some, or maybe expound upon that a little bit more? I'm familiar with one Catholic scholar, Brent Petrie, who touched on some of the prophetic imagery that Mary was sort of fulfilled with in his book, Jesus and the Jewish Roots of Mary. And so, from an Islamic perspective, do you have any, or could speak to, like her birth story even, or some of her maybe prophetic imagery that
her own birth story?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, and I'll maybe take a look at that book. But I think that's one part of my argument, is that Mary doesn't only appear when she's giving birth to Jesus, but she actually has a birth story of her own, right? That she's about to be born. So you have this story of her origins, and then her becoming a young lady, and then eventually becoming a mother. So that speaks to this idea that she's like a hero and a protagonist and a model. And I think that birth story, I'm happy you emphasized it, is really powerful because it focuses on this woman who wants to have a child. Right? We all kind of, as a father, I can identify the first moment you know that your wife is pregnant or you're going to have a child, that you start dreaming, right? You start having expectations about what this child is going to accomplish. And then first you're being disappointed, but then being reassured by the kind of divine voice that this person is important and is going to have a role within society. So I think that birth story is sometimes overlooked, even within Muslims. They kind of overlook that. But I think it needs to be emphasized as part of the Marian journey.
Yeah, and if I may add to this, is this idea that it wasn't just her birth or the birth of Jesus that is important, but that both of these births have planetary implications, because Jesus is called a sign to humankind, right? Ayat al-Linas. And that is amazing, because it says this is something that's going to affect the whole humanity. And she's at the center of that story. And even when her birth was announced and when she was born, it was also indicated that this is going to be a world-changing event. So her birth, in a way, heralded or announced Jesus' birth. And both of these led to these monumental changes. Like you said, Christianity still is the largest religion in the world. That goes back and draws an inspiration from Jesus and Mary. And so the Quran accepts that these are events that affect whole humanity. But of course it puts its own signature on it, in the sense that it puts it within Islamic theological perspective, obviously. But even with that, there is no denying that this is an event, both of these events, the birth of Mary and the birth of Jesus, that have changed the history of humanity. And the Quran makes that clear. So that, I think, is to me what stands out in this story. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have a question. Have you looked at the similarities and differences with biblical story when it comes to not the birth of Mary, not her giving birth, but what's in between? Because in the Quran, there's a verse that talks about some of the almost miraculous life that she's had. Is there any correspondence?
Yeah, I'm really happy you raised that. And so there is this section, as you noted, there's her birth, and then there is her giving birth to Jesus. But then there is this interesting middle phase, right, of her life that's mentioned in Al Imran. So you mentioned the verse that Zechariah, he's coming into her chamber and then seeing that there's sustenance and there's fruits out of season. So then he asks her, where did you get these fruits? And then she says, these are from God, He provides sustenance بِغَيْرِ حِسَابٍ, without any limitation, right? So then Zechariah, he has an epiphany. He said, well, if Mary can go to God and God can give her fruits out of season and sustenance, then he can give me a child, because he had given up hope that he was older, that he wasn't able to have children anymore, his bones were frail, his hair was all white, and then he prays to God, and then he's given the child of John or Yahya. So this is a really important story that Muhammad is mentioning, because later scholars would actually build upon this. So there's actually this tradition of these female mystic scholars teaching older male scholars. So there's actually a chapter where I talk about that, where Rabia Alawiyya, she's seen as the deputy of Mary, or she's seen as someone who is like Mary. So she actually teaches other male figures lessons of spirituality. So one story is, there is this famous hadith master, or he's an expert in prophetic traditions, and he comes to Rabia and says to Rabia that I'm feeling a sense of insecurity in the world, and I'm feeling a sense of anxiety. So all of a sudden she starts to cry, and then he says, why are you crying? And then she says, Rabia, that you made me cry. He said, what did I do to make you cry? And he said that the peace that you're trying to find in this world, it actually needs to reside within yourself, right? So he was in the sense that he was running away from this ruler and that police enforcement, but in reality he needed to focus on his own spirituality and connection with God. So many later female mystics and teachers kind of build off this model. And this is where I kind of make the argument that Mary is not just a mother kind of in the Quran, or she's not simply a child that's born, but she's also a teacher, right? She's also teaching people about God and spirituality, and that also leads to, I think, a larger discussion of female instructors and professors and, mothers not just as nurturers, but also as people who are educators and people who teach their child important lessons in life.
So, any other questions or comments? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, yes, thank you so much. This was really, really cool. I I was really charmed too to hear some of the ties between your own story and upbringing with sisters and your daughters, and like, I understand like you sort of explained your backstory with Mary and with your co-author John, but did you always feel an attachment to Mary, like even before you got into academia, or when did you first start really seeing some of the parallels with your own life?
Oh yeah, and that's a really good question. And I was always interested in Mary, but I do think the first book, when you start researching and writing and then reading the works of other people, that made me gravitate to her. But then when I think about why did I like write a whole book, on this topic, and then it kind of goes back. Oh yeah, like my mom and like my sisters and my daughters, and obviously the book is not a memoir where I'm talking about my family and so forth, but I think it's important for authors and professors to be honest about where they're coming from, where they're kind of situated, what activities in the past, and really for all of us, like why are you working in this particular job, or why are you passionate about this nonprofit, or why are you involved with this social justice issue? I think all of us are products of our lived experiences and our background. So I think, yeah, that was something I had to explore. It wasn't something initially that just came out when was apparent, but something that kind of developed over time.
Well, thanks. Go ahead.
Yeah, just jumping on 2 questions ago, and Andy might actually know the answer to this, but the idea of women mystics and in Islam and in connection to Maryam, have you done any kind of comparative work or even looked at the position of Mary to women mystics in the Christian church, say the Middle Ages?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I haven't looked on Mary's connection with the Christian mystics, but there is a chapter and a couple of sections where I talk about Mary's influence on Islamic Muslim mystics. But that, I think, and that would be really interesting. Like, so this is part of the work. It's not the work, right? But it's kind of trying to open up other doors of inquiry or thought. And that's to be a really interesting study. Is like, how did maybe the Islamic Mary influence Christian mystics, and how did Christian mystics influence female mystics in the Islamic tradition? So I think there is this kind of cross-pollination that's important. And sometimes when we look at kind of the clash of civilizations thesis, like, oh no, this religion is very different than this religion, and like there's no impact or influence on one another. But I think what you're alluding to is really important, that there actually always historically was this kind of flow. People obviously recognize them as different religions, but they were dealing with similar questions and challenges and issues. And I think that would, might be a great future study or, future work that students could engage in.
Can you say a word or two about the Islamic Mary podcast?
Yeah, so
There you have some of these themes.
yeah, so some of the themes, I have this podcast, and I actually talk a lot about the Brzezinski Institute in the podcast and some of the work that we've done. So some of the themes, I do talk about like Mary as a teacher, or female figures in the Quran. Also this idea of the relationship between Christianity and Islam. I actually interview a lot of people who are Christian scholars of Islam or Jewish scholars interested in Muslim-Jewish dialogue or Islamic Buddhism. So obviously, I understand the religions to be separate and distinct and to respect everyone's personal beliefs. At the same time, I understand there is kind of this interaction and influence between them, and then people of difference can develop shared and collaborative projects. So I would encourage you to check that out. I actually had a recent interview with a Christian scholar of Islam. She's at Emory, good friend Diana Womack, and she comes from the Protestant tradition, and she actually examines missionaries and their history and how many of them became very fascinated with Islam. Many of them actually became scholars of Islam. They had many Muslim friends. So many of the seeds of the modern interfaith movement kind of emerged with these missionaries who actually went and lived with Muslims and learned their languages. Obviously, there's also kind of polemics and war and so forth, but I think she does a good job of a nuance of showing how the Christian community is varied, and there's different wings, and there are folks that want to have a positive relationship with people of other faiths and want to build those bridges.
Wonderful. Maybe we have time for just one more question or a comment, if there is one. Well, this was a wonderful conversation. Please join me in thanking both of you.